All right.
All set.
Well, I'll wait for that little. Are we on YouTube now? Are we live streaming now?
Yep, you're good.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Looks like we got another good turnout. And hopefully today will be a productive discussion. So we're going to call the meeting to order. Just run through the roll call real quick. It does appear that everyone is here on the committee. So we have Mark Curran, Bob Chapman, Dennis Smith, our ex officio member Sharon Mackey, Stephanie Jones, Jackie Stark, Antonio Don. It looks like the only person that's not on at this time is Wayne Primo. So that'll be our roll call for today. We have an agenda before us. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Support.
All right, great. So all in favor, if there's any discussion, I imagine not. All in favor, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
All right, all opposed, please say no. All abstaining, so that motion passes unanimously. And then we have our first public comment session. Do we have anyone here for public comment? Looks like not. So that'll end our public comment session on the new business. We have some minutes before us from our October 13th meeting. Do we have a motion to approve those minutes?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Great. Any discussion? No. So all in favor, please say yes.
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 All opposed, please say no. All abstaining. So that motion also carries unanimously. And so that will bring us to our only new business item of the day, which is our continuation of our discussion about zoning and affordable housing more broadly. So I just wanted to, before we kind of launch into things, just note that in the agenda here under correspondence, we did include a link to the Grand Rapids Housing Now recommendations that were made by the Grand Rapids Housing Committee, Housing Advisory Committee that David Allen shared with us last week. I think there's some really interesting recommendations in there. Some things we've already discussed, some different ideas that we certainly have not discussed. And some of these ideas may be appropriate only for a community the size of Grand Rapids. Some may be, many may be applicable to Marquette. But just if you all haven't already, would definitely encourage you to check that out and kind of just give it a good read through, because I think it will be good food for thought. I don't know if anybody has any comments about that.
It was interesting. It did seem a little bit like they were, I guess I enjoyed it more when I got past the ABDs, or accessory dwellings, because I don't think that's the answer. And I think there was a lot of information about those. I think what I took from it that we can integrate was some of their multifamily recommendations.
Stephanie, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you just as of a couple seconds ago.
Fine on my end.
Oh, okay. Sorry, maybe it's just the county internet here. I'm in my office. What did you say there, Stephanie, at the end?
I guess I thought it really concentrated a lot on the accessory dwelling units, which I don't think is the answer. And I think that it did have some good value when we're talking about modifying zoning when it comes to building multifamily. Because I really think, some of that, or at least smaller lots, is going to be the answer to our missing middle.
Sure. Did anybody else have any thoughts on if you had a chance to look over those Housing Now recommendations?
Yeah, I think what I noticed was
and in addition to what Steph's talking about, I think they were able to round up some money to help folks start off on their starter homes and maybe even get some, I don't know if they were condemned housing, but vacant housing that they must have rehabbed and be able to sell back. I mean, they had 150 houses. That was part of their initial stuff. And then it looked like they had a jump starting program, maybe similar to what Rural Development Association has as far as their loans they do through banks and stuff.
Just as food for thought, I don't know, it appears that Habitat for Humanity is now going away from building new and just renovating old. Maybe there's ways we can encourage them to keep that going as well.
Yeah, I think those are really good points as well. I think that as, David Allen mentioned at our previous meeting, we, as a city of Marquette, at some point, like he said, the city of Grand Rapids, they kind of had a little bit of skin in the game. And I think there's a lot we can do just from, in terms of policy and regulations and things like that. But at a certain point, we do, as a city of Marquette, need to get some skin in the game in some form. I think with affordable and missing middle housing development, we can kind of make some regulatory changes and kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom. But we also need to take some direct action as well, like they did. I do think that was something I took away from that. So appreciate those comments. So I don't know if anybody else had just any other thoughts on that before we kind of move on.
I was curious about the payments in lieu of taxes. I don't think we have anything like that here. Evan, I could be mistaken about a community fund or a trust fund or a pilot program here, that the payment in lieu of taxes would be something worth exploring if we talked about incentivizing developers to rehab some of these buildings. So I think that's probably a different conversation, but I did think that was an interesting point they made on that website.
We actually do have, this is Dennis, we do have several PILTs in the city for affordable housing. There is a statutory allowance for that. Some of them that come to mind are Oriana Ridge, the old orphanage, Grandview is another one that operates under a PILT. And basically what that program is instead of paying taxes, they can petition the city commission to get a payment in lieu of taxes up to 10% of what their tax bill would be in return for providing them service on the property, which would be your regular public works, snow plowing, and police and fire and things along those lines. So that is an option that's out there.
Yeah, and I was going to say something similar, so thank you for bringing that up, Dennis. We, as a city commission, we actually just recently renewed, well, somewhat recently, it was like a year ago, but we renewed a couple of PILTs for some subsidized low-income housing complexes in the city. And so, I think that's definitely a model that's been proven to work, and something that we could potentially include in some kind of report as, hey, this is something we've already done. It's a proven model that works in the city of Marquette that we could continue with future affordable, like lower income housing developments. But yeah, good point there, Antonio. And I guess just like a final, anybody have any other comments about that housing, those housing now recommendations? I think there's some.
I just wanted to throw something out there. If you really look at how much it costs to actually build in an affordable house or an affordable apartment, to upgrade it to something really nicer floor coverings, you still have all your drywall, all you're doing is upgrading kitchen cabinets, flooring, and trim. Doesn't cost that much more to upgrade it into something really nice, and you get a lot more bang for your buck out of it. So that's another factor of why it's more and more difficult. That's why you don't see people buying or building the affordable stuff. By just upgrading 10 to 20%, you get 40% more on your money.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that was also something I thought was interesting. You know, as you mentioned, Mark, and as Dennis mentioned, you know, that idea of kind of renovating. You know, and I think that really, you know, goes right along with some of the discussions we've had. You know, I was reviewing before this meeting all of our minutes from our previous meetings, and we had a couple different discussions about, look, you know, young people don't own homes, you know, in Marquette, and you know, we maybe need to get some more renters to pursue home ownership, and that's something we should be promoting. But young people seem to have a hard time, you know, doing the traditional fixer-upper kind of, you know, starter home sort of thing, because they don't have often like the financial resources to actually fix up the home. So maybe that's something we need to look at. You know, moving on, I think that what I was hoping to do today was to just see if anybody, you know, had beyond the specifically, you know, the housing now recommendations. If anybody, at first I want to have just a kind of a wrapping up our discussion about zoning that we kind of started last week and how that dovetails with missing middle housing and affordable housing. See if anybody had some final thoughts now that we've had a month to kind of think about things. We've reviewed the minutes. And then was really, after we get done with that, my goal is to kind of dedicate at least, you know, a solid, you know, 45 minutes or an hour, you know, most of the meeting to actually just having a discussion of kind of reviewing what we've already talked about and sort of just having a preliminary kind of brainstorming session about things that we've discussed at some point over the last year or so, really. And see, just kind of randomly, you know, just throw ideas out there about what might be included in our report for January. But for now, I don't know if anybody has any final kind of thoughts or reflections or things they wanted to add about the zoning discussion we had last month.
Well, I have one question that we didn't really touch on, building new. And Dennis, I'm hoping you can add some to this. You know, stormwater, it's a big factor. It floods out a lot of properties, but building stormwater ponds also eats up a lot of your land. And it seems like the city is now wanting more stormwater ponds, which is a good thing environmentally, but then it beats up on how many units you can put on that land. Where do we really stand with stormwater right now?
Well, I can answer a portion of that. The city stormwater ordinance that we have does provide for certain credits available to developers. And one of the things that we've been considering with this is, of course, that fee is used to upgrade our stormwater infrastructure throughout the entire city. More recently, we're seeing some increased challenges with stormwater itself based upon the large storm events that we're getting. You know, it wasn't too long ago up in the Keweenaw, they had like 1,000-year storm. And, you know, we design everything here in the city for typically a 500-year storm event when we do it new, but we have a lot of infrastructure out there that hasn't been upgraded. So we've been having some discussions internally about possible stormwater credit for developers who would be interested in designing their stuff a little bit more robust to help the city system on large parcels of property. How that relates to this discussion is, I don't believe that the stormwater itself is going to go away. We have to find ways to deal with it, and I think that Mr. Kern is absolutely correct in that when you consider the density of a development, you're really going to have to look at some of the stormwater issues that would be done there. Most certainly, you could put in any recommendation to the City Commission in your report, along with all of the other recommendations that you're going to provide about future tasks for a housing committee or staff. You could roll looking at stormwater into it, and how you could accommodate something like that. I mean, water's got to go somewhere, and you know, with the topography we're blessed with in Marquette, sometimes it's a blessing and a curse, especially being in, you know, an area right adjacent to Lake Superior. That I could probably predict Mark's thoughts on this, that would just deal with, because you're on the shores of Lake Superior, that brings in about 3 different government agencies as well.
So it's something to really think about. I mean, because we've been pushing to be more green in the city. We've been pushing to be a lot more environmentally friendly. Then we've been trying to control our stormwater. Now we're going and we're talking about putting parking on front yards, which means more pavement, which then means more stormwater runoff. So it's, you know, it's a big all-encompassing thing when we think about density on this lot.
And that's one thing to add into your kind of toolkit as you think about that. We have a new city engineer, and he thinks a little bit differently than the old city engineer, and he and I are aligned pretty well on a few things. And one of the things that we have approved for some new front yard parking spaces with rentals are basically just some tiles that you put on the grass, so the grass grows through them, but they provide a hard surface underneath so the water can go through it. And if you want to check that out, I could probably send you an address of a couple of those that we've done.
Now, there's also permeable concrete, I believe, is one of the architectural
Permeable
designs
concrete doesn't work in the UP.
Yeah,
that up.
I would kind of concur with Mark on that because of the freeze thaw we have. The stuff that we found is actually a composite material that basically looks like a fence, and you just bury it in the ground at ground level, and what it does is it prevents you from getting tire marks on the grass, but you still have to mow the lawn. But that's, you know, from my standpoint, and if I could just interject, from the guy that deals with the phone calls about front yard parking, that's going to be a big hurdle for you folks, because there are a lot of people that do not like it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Dennis. You know, and it's definitely, you know, as you know, Dave mentioned at the last meeting as well. You know, that's something that the winter parking ban is a challenge, and something that you know, we're going to have to figure out how to address one way or another. You know, I don't think that the way that things currently work is just not conducive to gradual increases in density in the zoning code, and it's not conducive to flexibility. And I think that we definitely will need to have discussions about some kind of workaround in the future, but also recognizing the potential political obstacles to that as well.
Yeah, there's 2 things that come to mind that I don't know if Dave brought up, and I trust that he did, but you do have the option in the land development code of taking a parcel on a block and creating a parking lot on it in a neighborhood. And this is really going to make Public Works mad with the second one, but you know, ever since the 2005 community master plan, the planning department has advocated for allowing parking on one side of the street with the exception of a snow emergency. But implementation of that is going to require some police work and a change for Public Works, and I'm not so sure that they're really going to like it. But those are 2 options that just come to mind in case they weren't mentioned by Dave.
Well, and it's funny that you mentioned that, and I don't want to monopolize this conversation, or I want to really hear what committee members think, but I did just want to comment that I mean, honestly, I do think it's pretty encouraging that the planning department has already been having those thoughts, because to be honest, like, that was a thought that occurred to me, and having, you know, there are a lot of communities that do it that way, where they have perhaps on a rotating basis parking on one side of the street. And I thought it was kind of striking, especially this month, or this past month, where we did have, you know, I mean, obviously it was October, so it wasn't a, you know, feet of snow, but we did have a record-breaking snowfall. It was pretty wintry out there, and there was no winter parking ban in effect, and we kind of worked around it.
Nobody died. No, I mean, we worked
Yeah.
through it. So.
So anyway, do any other
Shut up now.
or sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I'm gonna be quiet now because I don't want to take over your meeting, but I thought those points were good for the committee to hear.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that, Dennis. Does anybody
But
else
I
have
also,
any comments
but I
about
also don't think we should, I don't think we should depend on those. You know, we do have snow emergencies and we do get a lot of snow. And I would love to see a little bit more flexibility, but I don't want our recommendations to be based just on a few things. Does that make sense?
I
That
agree.
makes
Yeah.
I have one
a
thought.
broad array of things. I agree.
Yeah.
Is there, I don't know how we can do it, but especially in the bigger, newer developments, encouraging underground parking or parking structures. I don't know if there's almost a way we could help to benefit. It's very expensive to put in underground parking with the fire ratings and the concrete that needs to be above it. But if there's ways to encourage that, it saves a lot of green space and does give us that opportunity to have the stormwater and the percolation factors. So I don't know if there's ways of doing that. Maybe if there's some tax incentive or something.
I can only speak to, okay, I said I was gonna shut up, but this is probably an important one too. I can speak to like the Cliffs Dow site and a couple of the larger properties that we have available for development. I don't think folks are gonna have a choice if they do residential on there other than having to put parking on the ground floor below any residential units because of the potential for vapor intrusion. So that kind of stuff will come into play as well. And I think you're seeing that on Lakeshore Boulevard, kind of by Fred's Rubber Stamp. Isn't there a fella that's putting two side by side that are basically small homes on top of garages? And I don't disagree. I think that's probably a real viable option for the committee to consider.
I feel like I just want to jump in and say there's a lot of secondary issues that we're talking about when we're talking about increasing density of population in like a small area, which is what we're talking about. You know, the city of Marquette's not huge and there's not a lot of places to build new. So a lot of the options seem to be allowing people to add to their current buildings with, like Dennis said, homes above garages or turning a basement into an apartment or things like that, which does allow for more people to live in that area. But I feel like there's got to be some sort of give and take here where if we're going to offer these recommendations to allow more people to have more housing in the city, that maybe, yes, these houses are now available to you, but maybe you have to share a car, or maybe you walk or have a bike, or, you know, it's kind of a give and take. And if you want to have two cars and you want to have a big house, that maybe the east side of Marquette is not the place for you in your life right now. You know what I mean? A little devil's advocate, I guess, but I feel like we're trying to accomplish a lot for a group of people that, like, it's, you know, if we're starting to plan the city out from scratch, that's one thing, but we have to change what exists. And I think a lot of the things that we're talking about are difficult and not necessarily realistic. I can't imagine an underground parking garage on the, like, in the east side or the south side or like anywhere in the city, you know?
Well, it's interesting. On the east side, there are some homes that originally had parking in the basement.
Yeah, I think that, you know, Jackie, you do raise a fair point, though, which is that, you know, perhaps we need to say, you know, instead of, and this is, you know, just me personally speaking here, perhaps, especially in those somewhat, more like medium density neighborhoods, right? Perhaps we need to start shifting our expectations a little bit about how much parking is going to be available given that you're within easy walking distance of many amenities downtown in many of those neighborhoods. Like if you're talking about certain parts of the east side, you know, like you said, it's hard to. This is a big challenge I think we face is that continuing to meet the current expectations for how much off-street parking is going to be available in all cases, you know, that are these expectations that are imposed by the city, you know, sometimes it's just not realistic, and it can preclude positive developments and gradual changes. And I think that's, you know, parking needs to be a really important part of the discussion. But I think you raise a valid point that, like, you know, especially younger generations, like, or as you know, the population ages perhaps and like tries to downsize and wants to be within walking distance. So like when they're older, maybe they don't have to drive every time they want to get groceries or go to the store. You know, there is that evolution taking place in preferences, I think.
The availability of public transportation, I think, has some impact on this too, particularly if it's economical or even free to residents. I just think parking in front yards is aesthetically awful.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that we should totally ignore all these other issues that would come with whatever changes we would recommend, but I don't want potential problems to stand in the way of us recommending anything because we don't know how to fix all of the problems right now.
Yeah. I think that the parking issue merits further discussion, but frankly, my feeling is that I would be much happier, because I agree with you actually about the front yard. I agree with, you know, Mark, I agree with Bob about the concerns about the aesthetic of front yard parking. And I think that we might have more fruitful discussions, you know, Department of Public Works notwithstanding, about the potentially how to modify the existing winter parking ban instead of saying everybody park in your front yard, and make the neighborhood look like crap.
And I do think that Jackie hit it on the nail on the head when we talk about expectations. As someone who sells homes to people who are often first-time home buyers, one of the reasons they move out to the townships is because they want parking and a big yard and things that they just necessarily can't get in the city. And on the flip side, when you look at some of the new development, especially the development in Founders Landing, a lot of those aren't going to work for some people. They're shooting it towards that missing middle, but I think their pricing is still a little high, but it has to be because that's what it costs to build. But they are doing parking on the first level, and then everything else is upstairs. So then you're putting into stairs into the equation that a lot of people are going away from. So it's a balance. And I think Jackie was right when it's expectations, managing people's expectations.
I would agree with you there, Steph, but I think that if we look at like those two little houses down by Lakeshore Bike, that's very similar to what they do like in South Carolina in the tidal areas where, you know, they have big surges during hurricanes and storms. So everything's built like on pylons, or at least it's up, so you don't lose as much. I think at the Gaines Rock or whatever that's called down the street, they're doing a lot of that too. I think the downside is that you really are going to target a very specific age grouping, because somebody my age 70 above isn't really into all the multi-stairs, although they're great. We like the way they look at it in Georgetown, we're in DC or whatever, but I think the reality is it's going to be more people your age or Mark's age or Evan's age as opposed to my age.
I will tell you, 50 and up now is saying, I want main floor bedroom. And that used to be a lot older number. And so when I'm seeing the new development, if that's not if your target demographic is someone who can afford it, that's often people who are above 50. So that's the frustration.
Yeah, I agree.
Good point. Did anybody else have any kind of final points with the zoning, discussion that we had last week specifically that we maybe want to have, brought into the space here? If not, I would just offer that, and this can maybe be a transition into our discussion that hopefully we can have for a little, the rest of the meeting here, or most of the rest of the meeting, about what recommendations we would actually like to see in our January report. And this is obviously, not a binding discussion. We're not going to be voting on anything today, but the idea is really to just kind of brainstorm and come and, put forward ideas and dig back up ideas that we've discussed in past meetings as well, that we all remember. So, I mean, in that sense, I think that we can transition pretty well. I can kick things off a little bit with, I think, a couple interrelated ideas that I had. That I really brought from the last meeting, from our discussion the last meeting, which is that we had some discussion about allowing duplexes and accessory dwelling units as permitted uses in the single family, the medium density and the low density districts. And I think that's something we definitely need to consider. A related issue, of course, is the off-street parking issue, and how do we perhaps ease up on the off-street parking minimum requirements, while also potentially easing up on or finding some workaround with the winter parking ban. And then I think a really important point that was brought up last week by David Allen and Dave Stensis, that was that we need to gather public input as well about these potential changes. And I don't think we should view that public input as a referendum, as, oh, this is binding, but it's definitely, we need to consider that public input and hear that constructive feedback and criticism from the community as well. So getting some kind of survey together, I think all three of those things in my mind kind of go together.
I do think with public input, it's best when you give options and not.
Lost you.
Yeah, we lost you there a little bit, Stephanie. You can just repeat that last sentence there.
I think we lost her audio.
I think that what she was saying, was, and I agree with this, was that you want to provide people with options on any kind of survey, as opposed to kind of a yes/no binary. And I'm sure she'll correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's what she was saying, just from reading lips a little bit. But yeah, Steph, if you want to drop, if you're still having audio issues, if you want to drop your comments down in the chat down below, then we can check that out.
I just get momentarily internet is unstable, which is gonna kill me. But I think that's exactly right. Is just, we need to give them some options to focus on instead of that, what do you want? Everything's fine.
Mm-hmm. So does anybody else have any other, those are the ideas I would offer. If anybody else has any comments or, other ideas of your own that you remember that we've discussed, or new ideas you want to bring in and kind of spitball with us here.
I think one thing that's been almost every meeting is finding a way to incentivize the developers, whether that's in tax abatement. The average middle income worker that needs housing is not going to be building their housing. So we need to figure out what we can do to incentivize developers and make it affordable for them. Would you agree, Mark?
Yes, the biggest thing is to make it black and white and straightforward.
Well, I think a part of that too, that Mark has brought up several times, is streamlining permitting. which is a thing that would come with lots of other municipalities and people working together to make sure that it's a simple process that doesn't require multiple permits for the same thing.
I don't know how you're going to get away from that with city, state, feds. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, the real challenge would be to have, recommend like a liaison from the city commission to work with the state and above, or perhaps the county and above. I mean, we're happy to do things at the local level to make things quite a bit easier. And I think, the next round of LDC amendments that are going to the city commission, there's a really big change in there for site plan review, particularly for like multifamily developments that, if it's only X number of units or something or less, the staff can approve it, which, it used to be that kind of thing would have to go back to the planning commission. I think the real hang up for the developers in the community, and Mark can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not so much the staff interaction when you have a staff permit to do, but it's when you get before the planning commission, and the planning commission can drastically alter plans or economics from time to time for some of these developments. And we've been trying to find ways to, for lack of a better term, kind of keep the planning commission in their lanes and have them planning the city. And at the same time, when they look at a development under site plan review, they're really looking at those standards that can, quite easily be met. And it's not really like asking them just to check the box, but in a way, to be honest with you, the way that the statute is set up, that's really what their function is, because they operate as a zoning board. So, but I really think you're going to need to look above at county, state, and so on. Would you agree, Mark?
I would, but let me throw some comments in on there. I think we need to, the planning commission can come up with a lot of great ideas, but after you spent, $30,000 to $80,000 on your set of prints, and you get in front of the planning commission, you're not going to want to take their suggestions. Maybe they're really good, and go back to your engineers and your architects, redo everything, and then come back again. It would be far better if you get in front of the planning commission with your preliminary prints, and then the planning commission give you approval based on almost an envelope. You can't be higher than this. You have to hit your setbacks. Yes, we want to see if you're going to be closer X trees, but then you could take that input back. Well, you just have, basically, if you could get your architect to draw up a pretty picture, but not hit every elevation, every line size and pipe size. I mean, right now you have to have all your electrical and mechanical and everything all drawn out, which is tens of thousands of dollars. But if you could have that just as a tentative picture, go to the planning commission. The planning commission might say, hey, well, did you think about putting some underground parking in there? That would really help out. You might go back and say, hey, well, if I can do underground parking, it helps out with green space, helps out with stormwater, and you might take those suggestions and put them in there. So
and that would be really new, because there is already a provision in there for preliminary site plan review. The challenge that we would need to come up with is what you're speaking to, is have that preliminary review be somewhat binding, and then rely on staff to enforce that later on, which I think it could easily be done.
Because that way, hey, you want to move a patio, you want to redesign some sidewalks, because you think after the fact, oh, I got snow removal I have to deal with.
I think that's a really good point there, Mark. And I remember you mentioning that exact same idea with the site plan review, trying to make things a little bit more flexible and taking almost like more of a form-based approach to site plan review as opposed to the detailed site plan. So yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion, and I mean that's definitely something that we should consider. I agree with Jackie. It's something that keeps on coming up over and over. Anybody else have any other thoughts or ideas?
If you wanted to check it out, you could look in the LDC under sketch plan, and there's a whole section on sketch plan. The real challenge here is how we get that sketch plan to be able to be binding. The way it's set up now is a developer can come in with a sketch plan, get those recommendations from the planning commission, and then come back for final approval. And I think what I'm hearing here is, the developers would like to see the sketch plan basically be the approval. So, I mean, there's probably a way to come up with that mechanism, but it is under sketch plan if anybody wants to look at it in the LDC.
I think that would help out a lot of developers.
I did have a question, and I guess you'll have to forgive my ignorance on this, but I think that one of the things we've talked about a lot is zoning, right? And it's a thing we're talking about today. And I understand zoning as far as not having large multifamily apartment buildings in certain spots in the city, because you kind of lose that white picket fence neighborhood feel when you have buildings like that. But as far as taking homes and allowing them to be duplexes or triplexes, or allowing them to have an extra unit above their garage or things like that, does that decrease the value of homes near them? I mean, outside of requiring extra parking for the extra people, but if we're just talking about opening up some neighborhoods to allow more units like that, is that a problem as far as home values? Or I guess why wouldn't we do that outside of the parking conversation?
It's already permitted in the land development code.
Everywhere in the city, you can build a duplex anywhere you want?
Well, the accessory dwelling unit, there is already a provision for that in the land development code, which is our zoning ordinance. And during the latest round of amendments, they are making that a little bit more user friendly. To actually, I think they're making it kind of like a use by right with some conditions, like you have to record a document that would prove it's on owner occupied property. So I think when we went through this exercise for accessory dwelling units, a lot of communities across the country, the big concern for the community, and not so much the planners or advocates of affordable housing, but the communities themselves, is just what Jackie's speaking to is, what if somebody buys a property next to me and then it's, Iron Bay Rentals or something, and they rent the primary house and then they build an accessory house in the backyard and they rent that too. That could be a situation where you could have a challenge, because to be honest with you, if it's just a rental situation like that and primarily targeted for NMU students, without sounding incredibly racist, cynical, or anything else, right, we have a lot of challenges with those type of rentals. So one of the controls that was put in by the Planning Commission is if you're going to have one of these, you can be permitted, but we want it to be owner occupied. That way, the owner is on site, making sure it doesn't, turn into Animal House. And also, that's a way for that owner to be able to afford that property. So I think that's the avenue the Planning Commission was looking at, to allow those as they are now.
And I think that's the direction. I mean, if that's the direction I would think we would go in, because owner occupied is a way for middle income housing to exist, because then you have people there who can help you pay your mortgage.
Yeah, and I think I think that's a great point, Jackie. I would totally agree with what you said, and I think that to clarify, right now, triplexes, you mentioned accessory dwelling units, duplexes, and triplexes, and Dennis, please correct me if I'm wrong, but Dennis did a very good job of just explaining the ADUs. The duplexes are allowed in, I want to say, most, if not all, of the residential zoning districts in the city, but they're allowed in special land use. So you need to go through a separate permitting process for that. And then the triplexes, I believe, would only be allowed in the mixed use or multifamily districts, which are greater than they used to be, but still somewhat limited. Is that fair, Dennis?
Yeah, that's very fair. Good description.
So I think what we're having a discussion about, like what my recommendation was that I made, the idea I threw in the hopper earlier that we kind of discussed at the last meeting as well. I think Dave Stentz has mentioned it. A couple other folks have mentioned it, is like, let's, at least for duplexes and accessory dwelling units, look at potentially making those a permitted use, where, you know, from the permitting standpoint, we're not treating them differently from like single family homes necessarily, and do that throughout the single family. I think the triplexes or fourplexes or greater density, that's another discussion that could be had, and I think should be had, but at least like let's start there would be my thought. But I don't know what other people think about that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Dave was on the call. He may be able to chime in, but I think some of the more recent amendments in the land development code also allow a little bit more for the duplexes in favor of that, kind of moving away from that special use permit or reducing some of the setbacks and making it easier, but we have not addressed the triplexes and above yet.
And I'm not sure if Dave's with us here, but I do know, if he chimes in, that's great. I do know that at least from the document that was sent to the city commission for our review a little while ago, I didn't see any changes to whether duplexes or ADUs were, like, they were still special land uses, from my recollection. But yeah, there were changes to setbacks and things that I thought were definitely very positive.
Right. Okay.
Does anybody have any other ideas or thoughts?
Evan, my question would really be, is there some sort of a restriction in any of our codes for housing that kind of limits, quote unquote, the number of bedrooms on a particular lot? The reason I'm asking is, like, if you get into the township and stuff where they have septics, you know, they give the septic permit based on the number of bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, whatever. Is there something, thinking about what Jackie just said a few minutes ago, that would restrict the number of bedrooms that would be added onto a building, or to kind of limit the number of people or parking, or do we not have those restrictions at all?
We have, this is probably appropriate for me to answer. The current code doesn't look at it per se so much as bedrooms as it does number of related persons or unrelated persons. And we just had a situation in a neighborhood in town where currently, if you have a rental property, you can have no more than 4 unrelated. I believe they had at one point up to 8 or 9, and then they reduced it to 6, but the neighborhood had an issue with it. So we ended up having to send a notification letter to have them vacate, 2 of the people in there. So it's no more than 4 unrelated, but not necessarily based upon bedroom.
Yeah, and I think that just kind of like a little thing I would add on to that with the ADUs, because they do get treated a little differently. I think we kind of talked about this at the last meeting, is that I think there were a couple folks that actually, this was during the work session between the city commission and the planning commission, where we were discussing some of the upcoming land development code amendments. And one of the topics that a couple different city commissioners mentioned that they'd like to see addressed is with the accessory dwelling units, with other rentals, presumably most ADUs end up being rentals. With other rentals, we have this 4 unrelated person requirement that, like Dennis is talking about here, but with ADUs, we limit it to 2 people. And so something that was discussed at that meeting was potentially treating ADUs like we treat other rentals with regards to residency, occupancy restrictions and things like that. That was something that was mentioned at that meeting. So I figured I would bring it into this meeting as well. It kind of jogged my memory.
Mr. Chair, this is Dave. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
So I just, to answer the question that went by a couple minutes ago, the ADU and duplex situation is something the Planning Commission wants to, I think, wait to see where things are headed with the recommendations from your committee to the full city commission and, you know, get some more public input on that, because even the use by right or permitted use is a better term we learned at the last meeting. Permitted use for those still is a jump, even though the density might not in every case be significant. It won't really necessarily be significant with an ADU, but with a duplex, you could easily have 8 adults in it. We see that, and that's the reason those probably were made special use a long time ago, in the 70s probably. But the recommendations in the LDC that are going to public hearing next week at the Planning Commission level, and then to the City Commission on the 21st of December, include some changes Dennis mentioned to make the review process easier for multifamily units less than 5 units. 5 or less would be just a zoning compliance permit for new ones. So that's as simple as it gets. That's not site plan review at all. That's like we do with new houses. We basically just make sure they're placed properly on the lot. They're not over any of the setbacks, or they're not too big, anything like that. And then the next level is the 26 to 20 units by administrative site plan review, and then anything more than 21 goes to the Planning Commission, or anything more than 20. So that's hopefully an answer to that question.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. I just wanted to, before we move on with other comments, I did just want to raise a couple things that got brought up in the chat. And to those who wrote these things in the chat, feel free to chime in, please. But I saw that Sharon Mackey had shared that one question we should be looking at answering, or at least asking in the report, is, you know, what is the target population the city would like to attract? So maybe that's a question that we should think about. Antonio then asked, aside from the college student off-campus rentals, do we know what the current demand is for rentals, and what does that renter population look like? And I think those are both really good questions that we probably could have some answers to right now, but I don't know, do either of you want to touch more on those questions and kind of some of your thoughts there?
I can go first. From the QPAD study that we reviewed, I think back in August or so, there was 750 rentals that were cited on that report. That seems awfully low, but I would like to maybe explore more of that rental market population as we get into potentially incentivizing developers to build. How many units are we, do we need essentially? What is the demand for that? And that may become more informed discussions from surveys, from community input. Just something that don't want to lose sight of as we, continue to discuss that further.
And from my question, I can tell you that the demand for rental is obviously low income. There are a lot of people that are unable to get appropriate transportation to get into doctor's appointments and other type things. So if this city of Marquette wants to look to that population, then there are certain needs that are going to need to be met. And one of the huge ones is parking and transportation. Unfortunately, low-income people usually need to have a car because where they are looking at living is outside of Marquette. So therefore they have a car so that they can get in because the transportation is not as good. So if the transportation were better, the need for low-income housing would be lesser in the city of Marquette because people would be able to access it. The other thing is the walkability. If you look at what 10 years ago, the buzzword was walkability. 7 years ago, maybe it was walkability, and it was all about having a 1 to 2 bedroom apartment for a single or young couple that is going to work at home and is not going to have the car and is going to be walkable. So if the target population we're looking for is the work at home population, the set of rules we're going to be looking at adapting is one focus. If we're looking at families, it's a whole nother focus because we will have to have those 2 cars and parking. So I think it's really who does the city of Marquette want to attract, and then take and adapt the rules according to that population.
I think Stephanie also brought up a very good point in the chat that I was wondering too, are we wanting to incentivize rentals or people able to purchase homes, or both? I think we're talking about 2 different things right now.
And I think, Jackie, that's exactly what I'm referring to is what does the city of Marquette do? Does the city of Marquette want to encourage buying? Do they want to encourage buying and renting a duplex, or do they want to encourage affordable rentals? Those are such different categories out there and different populations.
I think it's a really good point. I think that we can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time there, where I think we can, it's like yes and. I don't think we necessarily need to choose exclusively between those options, but definitely I think we need to be keeping those different needs and those different target populations in mind. That's at least, my initial reaction there. Stephanie, I don't know, since you raised the question, do you have any other thoughts on that or anything you wanted to say?
I think we just have to be very specific which lane we're addressing with which recommendations.
I would also add that the city has a housing commission that is supposed to provide low-income housing for people. So we already have something in place to start with, at least if we're talking about increasing low-income housing availability.
And I think what part of the genesis of this was kind of focusing on that missing middle. I think while I think that lower income housing is absolutely a necessity, I think there is more grants available there. There's more government programs available there. There are other things that are meeting potentially that need, whereas that above that what we've been calling the missing middle, nothing is meeting that need in creating more housing for that need. So I don't want to spend too much of our time with something that is being met elsewhere. Does that make sense? And does that sound cold and callous?
I don't think it sounds cold and callous at all, Stephanie, personally. But I do think that one of our recommendations should probably, based on the discussions we've had, and this is maybe an idea I'll throw back into the space that we've discussed previously, is that we do have a demand in the city for more, and I think, Sharon was alluding to this, I think Jackie alluded to this, that we do clearly have a demand for more low-income rental housing in the city as well. And of course, there's other parties like the Housing Commission specifically that are going to be more responsible for that. But I do think that should probably be one of our recommendations, is that we need to find some way to develop more subsidized low-income housing in the city. I do think that's something that we should include.
Except that there are programs incentivizing that currently.
There are a lot for affordable home or for affordable apartments. I mean, if people want to deal with it and deal with Section 8 and different voucher programs, you can almost get your building paid for completely. But it's really tough to run them. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm sure Sharon knows it's just tough to run those programs. You know, one thing we also need to look at is what's going to be the best interest for the city and tax base. Is it going to be the bigger apartments, or is it going to be the single family homes? I mean, how, I know the affordable stuff is going to affect the tax base, but what would be better for the city? More single family homes or apartments? I mean, the city needs cash to run.
Yeah, I agree with Mark and Stephanie there. I think our focus really was initially always that middle missing. So we have a stable residential population in the city, and it creates more tax base, creates more revenue, creates more students in the schools. Not really against apartments, but I don't think that's really what our charge was when we started looking at affordable housing for the population. When you talk to other business folks in town and they're trying to get more people to come in and live here, maybe that live at the other end, it's because they can't afford to get a home in the city that they could live in. And I think that's kind of the focus was where we started off. And I would not really kind of be all that much in favor of looking at low income housing and spending a lot of time on rentals.
And I do think one of the discussions that came out of the short-term rental discussion was how high Marquette City percentage of rentals already is. And that, and Dennis, you may have been at that meeting. That's an issue for Marquette because our rental percentage now is over 55%, if I'm correct. And
You're in the ballpark. I don't have the number off the top of my head.
%52 in 2010.
Yeah, 54 here on my report. Sounds about right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Evan, go ahead.
Oh, no, Jackie, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it makes sense to talk about rentals if we're talking about how rentals will help people afford home buying. I think rentals, just as rentals, is a separate conversation.
I think what Stephanie was getting at, and I couldn't hear her, but I think from the earlier meetings, the issue of the short-term rental was that the short-term rental could be taking away from possibly having a unit available for sale. Is that correct?
that has been some people's fear. Not saying it's valid, but yes, some people feel that.
And I think some of the discussion that this committee had was that the homestay would be a potential for a good thing for somebody to be able to afford a house.
And maybe that's a recommendation, spitballing here, but we, keep the short-term rentals capped unless it's homestay.
Yeah, that could be.
It is a very great way to move into affordability. And when I'm talking to buyers, they don't have that option.
I think you also lose a lot of the problem people I think are concerned about is people are going to buy homes and turn them into party houses on Airbnb. But if it's an owner occupied home and the Airbnb renter is there with them, there's a lot more oversight.
I think those are really good points about the short-term rentals, and just so everybody is aware, like I do think that from the very first meeting we identified that we want to have a meeting where we focus on short-term rentals at some point. We want to have a meeting where we have an in-depth discussion about student housing needs, at some point. just with the timeline and with COVID-19 kind of delaying things, we haven't been able to have some of those discussions yet. But this spring, my hope is that we can have, a meeting dedicated, or a good chunk of a meeting dedicated to each of those two topics that have been brought up a couple times today. And I would say that, personally, so again, we're spitballing ideas. So I definitely want to thank you, Stephanie, for bringing that back up, because it was a topic of discussion. I do think there's a lot of empirical evidence that easing up or raising caps on short-term rentals has led to gentrification and taken units off the long-term rental market in other communities, like big cities and smaller cities like Marquette. But definitely should be something we discuss further. I don't know if anybody else had any other thoughts, or have we kind of exhausted some of the ideas?
We had one question on the chat board from Stephanie talking about incentives. Is that something you want to tackle now, or leave it for a future meeting?
I think we were just kind of discussing that a little bit. I think incentives definitely is something that we should be discussing. What do we mean by that, right? Like do we mean assistance? With like renovating a home or something. Do we mean, brownfield or TIF, for a larger development? Do we mean something else entirely? Maybe density bonuses in our zoning code. I don't know. I mean, I definitely think that it's a good question. We kind of had this sort of rental versus owner-occupied discussion, but the question of incentives and what do we want to be incentivizing as a city is definitely a good one, something that we should definitely discuss further in the future. Stephanie says she needs to jump off for another meeting shortly. So that's fine. Thank you for your input, Stephanie. Does anybody have any kind of final thoughts here before we kind of wrap up?
Just wanted to add I know, Mark, you brought up the permitting process being such a toll. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on incentives for developers that you would feel might, be helpful, in a financial sense. So what was the cost that you look at that if you are building rentals for affordability or for in between that 600 to 900 range, 1 or 2 bedroom apartments, and you're solely doing it for that population, what could the city incentivize there that, for any developer to be able to build more units?
I think a lot of it is streamlining the permitting process. I mean, just for the Little Rippling River Campground, I have 167 individual permits. That's absurd. So I don't know.
Can I just ask you real quick, Mark? Sorry to just jump in. So 167 permits, are you saying that there's like permits from the city and the state that are permitting the same thing? I mean, I guess my question is how.
Yes, no, and maybe. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I had all my county permits set up to put in all my sewer lines in the campground. Well, then the DEQ didn't like the way we were going to do our piping. So then the DEQ said we had to surround all of our sewer lines with concrete. So, yes, there's a lot of back and forth and conflicting information. So, and I know for a single family home, it's much simpler, but then when you go into the bigger projects or someone wants to do I think we need to be looking at bigger developments of condos because they take up less ground and you can get more housing units in it. I think that's one thing we're really going to need to look at. And then that's going to be the big all-encompassing every state agency again.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for kind of reiterating that there, Mark. Unless anybody else has any thoughts, and if so, please interrupt me. But I think that we've really had a good discussion today, where we really brought a lot of these ideas we've already discussed back in. Some of these ideas will have to be discussed at future meetings and may not make it into our January report. Many of them I'm sure will. But just wanted to kind of close the meeting here with a couple of updates, and just reminders for folks. So, I think one idea that wasn't really raised, but we did discuss the idea of home ownership, promoting home ownership. How do we get more affordable single family units? Because a lot of the discussion we've had with regards to density and things like that has applied to units that realistically will mostly be rentals. And so how do we reach that those affordability goals for single family, owner occupied homes as well? And I think one really great possibility that David Allen mentioned last week, and that I've got quite a bit of experience working with already here at Marquette County, is modular housing. So like there's very high quality modular housing. They're not trailers. They look like nice little cute single family homes, and they are much.
Evan, let me just interject one thing. Modular housing does not finance the same as stick built. And so that's the problem we run into with modular.
Okay, could you expand on that a little bit, Steph? I know you got to get going, but do you have a minute?
Okay, there's 3 levels. There's stick built, manufactured, and module. And some manufactured is just almost impossible to finance, and some modular, depending on how it's built. And so some of those you just have to be careful. The modular, like Wausau and the panelized building, those tend to finance okay, but so often people use manufactured and modular similarly. And so I just want to throw that in, that we have to be careful because some don't finance the same.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I guess what I was referring to is the more panelized stuff. I mean, the county land bank right now is developing some workforce housing, kind of more affordable modular panel build homes in Ishpeming and Negaunee. And we've definitely seen there's some good options out there, and the financing would work for those. So
panelized, yes. Let's just be careful, because people use the words interchangeably and they're not always financeable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that manufactured homes or mobile homes, like that's a very different discussion from modular, but they do get blended sometimes. And yeah, I think we need to be clear. So thank you for bringing that up. But anyway, I think it's a good opportunity. And in fact, we've even, heard from, I recently got an email from Renovare Development, which it was involved with the Grandview apartments. They're doing a mixed income housing development in Munising right now, and they're kind of looking for potential communities in Michigan where there might be city-owned property to develop some modular single-family homes in that 50% to 120% area median income, so that affordable to workforce housing range as we defined it. And definitely, I think that hopefully the city will be following up with them at some point. So I'll keep you all.
I have. Yeah, I've followed up with them this morning.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, that's awesome. And so definitely just something it's not something for us, but it's for you all to be aware of. I think that even while we're working on these recommendations, the city can start making progress here, and taking advantage of some opportunities. So the other couple of things I just wanted to mention real quick. Of course, next month, most of our meeting is going to be devoted to a presentation about the old hospital property and how to potentially work around some obstacles to redevelopment of vacant properties for missing middle housing. That's going to be presented by Dan Perolik, who invented the term missing middle housing, and he's definitely an expert, and Shannon Morgan from Renovare Development here in Michigan. So we'll look forward to that. And then later in that meeting, I also hope that we will be able to find time to hear about some potential issues with new construction of housing from Lynn Swadley of Swadley Development, who's a local developer here, and I'm sure he'll have some great information and input as well. The other thing to keep an eye out for, Dennis mentioned this in the chat, but that I expect that I've talked to the folks from QPAD, our regional development and planning agency, and QPAD, as Antonio and Dennis alluded to, has been working on a housing needs assessment for Marquette, which is really great because actually, like David Allen mentioned last week, how Grand Rapids, they did this housing needs assessment as part of their data gathering process. And so we should have an early, more or less final draft of that available to us by our meeting sometime next month, based on my conversations with QPAD. And then that report and some of its recommendations and data can be integrated into our own report back to the city commission. So I'll keep you all apprised of that as well. But other than that, unless anybody has any parting thoughts, I guess we're in the agenda at the commission comment stage here.
Evan, I just shot that note to the group. I believe Dennis, myself, you, we all thought it would be a good idea for a recommendation to have the planning commission complete a community outreach survey at some point. So I don't know where we stand with that, but just wanted to put that as an easy recommendation that we can work towards.
Yeah, that was, I'm 100% on board with that. My only hang up in our email that we were going back and forth on is I thought it should come out as part of your recommendation rather than doing it without the.
I completely agree after giving it a little bit more thought, just based on the timing of everything being so weird this year. I think it would probably best be suited for the planning commission. Yes.
I would just say that this will possibly be a conversation that we have when we talk about new development, but I think the idea of permitting is interesting, and it's a thing that Mark talks about a lot, and that if that's a thing that the city does have control over, and if we can change the way that our permits are required to align them better with other agencies and not, decrease the reason for them being there, which is safety and making sure that they're meeting regulations within the city. But that to me seems like an area that we could definitely look at, and I'd be interested in doing that.
Great. Well, with that, I think that we're at 11:49. Want to be respectful of people's time. Thank you for those comments, Antonio and Jackie. I think that's definitely a good reminder. Something we talked about earlier in the meeting. We've got a lot of content that we discussed today, a lot of ideas, but I think it was important at this kind of intermediary stage here before our very packed meeting next month to be able to have this discussion. So looking forward to next month's meeting, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us and for making time. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month. I believe the date is December 8th. So thanks, and hope everybody has a nice day.